Are you a fan of repetition? Is there nothing you crave more than fighting the same enemies over and over and over again? If the answer to this question is yes, then Burning Fight is the game for you. Burning Fight is a beat-em-up arcade game released by SNK in 1991 for the Neo Geo MVS system. Introduced to steal a share in the then popular beat-em-up market, it was meant to compete with Techno's Double Dragon, the so-called leader of the genre at the time. And that was probably SNK's first mistake with this game. You see, Double Dragon was a terrible game to begin with, and by creating a game that is influenced massively by a terrible game is just a recipe for disaster in my opinion. But it wasn't just Double Dragon that this game was influenced by. There are massive similarities with Capcom's Final Fight, arguably the best side-scrolling beat-em-up in the arcades at the time of this game's release. The story of Burning Fight goes like this. A crime family called the Costellas from Metro City, and that's your first Final Fight influence right there, started ruining the peaceful city of Osaka with the violent Japanese group Heiwai Gumi. To stop the fight, Metro Police dispatched two dangerous characters, Duke and Billy, to Japan, where they meet up with the famous Japanese detective Ryu, or something like that. You see, it's impossible to know what the story is, as the game never tells you in the intro, or between levels, or even at the end of the game. But who cares about the story when the action is good, right? Well, Burning Fight is an average game at best. It's not a good game, but it's not a bad game either. It's just average, really. Firstly, the visuals are a bit below par for a game of this type, especially for 1991. The backgrounds are fine. In fact, I think the backgrounds look great in this game, and for all this game's flaws, the backgrounds must be the only thing in this game that don't really get repetitive. The sprites all look good when standing still, but the animations are quite poor on all of the sprites, and when the characters are scaled in from the background, it looks very jittery, almost like they're not scaled in at all, and you have three slightly larger sprites have been used instead. The settings for each level do look familiar as well, with downtown, construction sites and trains providing all the usual scrolling beat-em-up locations. Nothing original or new here. The sound is really crisp and clear. The gunshots, the explosions, and the sounds of the punches and kicks all sound like you would expect from this kind of game. But some sounds are a little odd. Like when Billy does his special attack, you hear these footsteps like someone treading on a marble floor. And the wooden crates sound more like cardboard boxes as opposed to wood breaking. The sound of the motorbikes is excellent though, and when I hear it, I am always put in mind of the movie Black Rain. And speaking of Black Rain, some of the game's soundtracks sound heavily influenced by the Hans Zimmer soundtrack. And while the tunes fit the game and levels, they are mostly forgettable. You won't be humming or whistling any of these while taking a leak, that's for sure. I cannot talk about the sound in this game without paying a mention to the Scottish accents in the game. The stereotypical "Hootsman! Hootsman!" and the way Castera says, "I'll kill ye!"
I'll kill you.
As a Scot, I have to say they sound alright, but it was a surprise to hear Scottish accents in a game that was set in Japan. They might have sounded more authentic if they had a bit of swearing in there, but I'm trying to keep my channel PG, so I can't say what I would have said if I were those guys. So now I come to the gameplay, and this is where Burning Fight really does let itself down. When you first start to play the gameplay is fine, but after level 2 you begin to notice just how repetitive the enemy characters are. I think there are only about 5 of them. Let's see. We have the guys with chains, the heavy guys in the dungarees, the guys carrying a weapon in jeans, these dynamite dudes, and the guy with a gun in the suit. And then they're all palette swapped. And when it comes to bosses, these guys are reused more times than a porno mag in a prison. Like this dude Marshall. I think you fight him like 5 times in this game. It's always something I have hated in games. When bosses are recycled to this extent. It does happen in other games, but usually they're not as strong as they were as an end of level boss. In this game though, they are every bit as strong. Anyway, so as if having a few more enemies to spice things up wasn't annoying, constantly seeing the same enemies screen after screen, we then have to suffer the set piece movement of their attacks. In games like Final Fight and Streets of Rage, the enemies quite often don't get time to attack, but not in Burning Fight. You could be getting stuck into an enemy and then all of a sudden they become invincible. They take a few steps back and attack you. The dungaree guys are the worst offender for this. Have a look here. You start laying the smackdown on this guy. Then all of a sudden, nothing. Then he steps back and runs towards you with his hands out. The boss characters are guilty of this as well, and it gets really tiring and boring. This is definitely one beat 'em up game where you suffer from fatigue. As I mentioned earlier, the game was heavily influenced and inspired from Double Dragon and Final Fight. Some of the locations have been lifted straight out from Final Fight, but not just that. At the construction site, as you ascend in the lift towards the level boss, you are confronted with a boss who moves around and jumps between background and foreground, just like in Final Fight level 4 with Rolento. The other obvious lift is the character design. Ryu looks like Guy and is even wearing the same colour outfit. Duke looks a little like Cody. The Dynamite guys are like Hollywood and the Molotov Cocktail guys from Final Fight. The game boss as well is wearing the same kind of get-up as Belgar. This game just steals so many bits from other games and movies, but yet it was nowhere near as good. I did play this game in the arcades round about the time it was out, and at the time I remember it being a great game to play, especially on 2-player. And so when I got my Neo Geo in 1994, it was a game I wanted to pick up at the right price, and I did. And when I got it home, I was a little surprised. It wasn't how I remember it, or it was maybe because in the space of those 3 years, other beat-em-ups got released that left Burning Fight in the shade. but for all of the deservedly so criticisms, Burning Fight, it is still weirdly an okay game to play every once in a while. Just not for repeated playthroughs, that's for sure. And that was my look back at Burning Fight on the Neo Geo. If you like this video, then please do give me a thumbs up and a sub, or maybe even a comment or two below about Burning Fight. And that's all from me, folks. Thanks for watching.